enclaves of their own, communities of their own, or if they're forced to be integrated in this side-by-side group, creating schools of their own that others can't join. So in India, for example, certainly in my time, almost anybody who could afford it had in the professional class put their kids in our public schools. And very few went into the government school system, except to the Kendra Vidyalayas, which themselves
stood apart for a reason.
Stood apart. And I think this is problematic because the people in those government schools or in the private schools, which the lower quality private schools, simply don't get as good an education.
And that's a function of, obviously, if you're meant for a different strata of society, the funding is lower, the attention is lower, the competition is lower, and thereby the results are also...
Absolutely. So right from the outset, you don't have a chance to get any of those good jobs. If you don't, then what kind of stake are you going to have in that system? You're going to say the system is skewed against me. Now, in the age where your aspirations were low, this didn't matter that much. You know, your father was thus and such job. You got the same job, and you didn't really want to move up. But we are in an age where technology also shows you what you can aspire to. And so in that sense, you know, everybody wants to move up. And frustration sets in when you know that there is really no possibility of you doing that.
With your permission, if I may focus on India, we've had free and compulsory primary education, at least in India, for several years. But it hasn't made a dent. Is that because of the lack of quality, or is it the lack of political will? What are we doing wrong?
No, I think as the ASER tests that you know, Pratham and its affiliates conduct suggest, quality is shockingly low in some areas. And if, you know, in 5th grade or 7th grade you can read at the 3rd grade level and not more, then we are not preparing those kids for the kind of world that they will come out into. And moreover, I think, you know, one is education, the other is even nutrition and healthcare. I mean, we have so many kids who don't get appropriate nutrition. And so the net effect is that the level of schooling that our children come out with is not that good.
So effectively you're saying the lack of good quality or any sort of quality education and healthcare is dooming and sentencing people to a lifetime of poverty and marginalization.
Exactly. It is a sentence. That's the appropriate word. And you know, when you look at India versus China, some of the studies that I've seen suggest one of the big differences is the quality of education, even at the outset of reforms. And that difference continues to... China had a much stronger basic level of education and much more widely spread. Of course, with the change in China, access is also shifting to really high quality education.
But in your book, you're not fully convinced with the American capitalist model, nor are you fully convinced that China's model is working either. Does it have to be a middle ground between the two?
The book emphasizes balance, and actually I'm more persuaded in the commonalities between a market system and democracy, which the liberal market system post-World War in the West provided. It seems to me that is also India's natural home, where we should be going. That is, have a vibrant private sector, but also have democracy, ensure that the opportunities created by the economy are widely available. And you can see again and again, certainly from the examples I give in the book, that democracy is a very important factor in this equilibrium. And you know, people who want to take bits and pieces, who say, you know, we want the democracy, but we don't want a private sector. We want a totally socialist economy. It doesn't work. I mean, name one socialist economy which is a vibrant democracy. What democracy does, in my view, is it separates the private sector from becoming dominated by the government and vice versa, because it keeps the level of cronyism and corruption in check. And again you see in the, certainly in the history of some of these developed countries, that it is the the scandal that is created by cronyism, that is opposed by democratic forces.
There is, of course, an argument of what sort of corruption was worse. The pre-liberalization corruption, which was all red tape, and you had to pay to get anything done, or the post-liberalization corruption, where the numbers or the quantum of corruption is just mind-boggling, and it just allows for a completely different animal to be created. What's worse?
Absolutely. So we should take heart from the fact that other countries have been through this.
Okay.
The United States, for example, in the late 19th century, under President Ulysses S. Grant, went through enormous levels of corruption. Entire legislatures were bought up, as I argue in the book, simply by railroad companies promising them all a free ticket.
No, but
wherever you want.
Has modern day America, current America,
Yeah.
found a solution to that? Is it not
It has brought
just
it down.
as bad, if not worse?
It has brought it down. It is no longer grand level corruption. Now,
Yes.
obviously, there is still a lot of money in politics. There's a lot of lobbying, and companies do get their preferred regulations through appropriate lobbying. But in all this, it's all about checks. How much is too much? And whenever it gets too much, you get the political reaction, as we had in this country. When the post-liberalization corruption reached a certain level, you had the emergence of parties like the Aam Aadmi Party,
Yes,
which
you'd
essentially
say,
are,
yes.
are focused on trying to contain that. And I think this is a process that will continue. That there will be, I mean, today, which government you think can get away with not auctioning sort of natural resources or licenses?
So I do want to ask you this now. The American system has, by trial and error, perhaps reached a point where the lobbyism is out in the open, where the political funding is out in the open, everything is declared. India has not. In fact, in the last several years, our political funding has become even more opaque. Do you believe that if we are going to look towards the West, for example, this is something that we need to focus on, because a lot of the crony capitalism can be hidden in political funding?
Right. No, I think I mean, it's a path.
Yes.
We are moving towards more transparency. We don't always take, no steps backwards and only steps forward. Sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, but we're steadily moving there. I mean, think about the right to information bill.
Yes.
Which was a very important bill in sort of trying to open up the workings of the government. Now, that was the action. Then we got the reaction, which is we got, habitual people who want information on everything and then sometimes misuse it because some employee has a grievance and then wants to push that grievance forward and through the right to information. And so there's action, there's reaction, there's further action. Eventually we will reach an equilibrium where in fact it works itself out in such a way that yes, the citizenry has that right to information, gets appropriately informed, and the government is constrained by that. I know that at the RBI, for example, we did sort of worry about how actions would look in public,
Yes.
because we knew that there was a right to information possibility that we'd have to answer to.
But I mean, just because you mentioned it, the Supreme Court, in fact, just yesterday has pulled up the RBI for not complying to the Supreme Court's instructions on the Right to Information Act. The RBI still stands, will it stand the exact way it doesn't apply to us?
As I understand it,
Yes.
there is an issue, and I don't want to go to the details because it is obviously sub judice. But the issue really is in your inspections. You can uncover a lot which is not available to the public. And if the public doesn't have all the information to interpret that particular this thing that you've uncovered, whether in fact that may cause apprehension, which is undue. So in other words, information without the knowledge to process it, right, may be.
But to be fair, that's an argument that could be made by anybody. The Ministry of Defense.
That is why I think the
Yes.
court will have to weigh this and
Yes.
decide whether this is something that can be exposed. The point is that unprocessed information you have to look at whether the positives and the negatives. If it's information about the behavior of a public servant, that is quite different from information about private entities which is not generally available and needs to be processed. We need to think about how to make that available to the extent it is. What level of aggregation do we, I mean, should I make available every, for example, there was a question about defaulters.
Yes.
Should the defaulter list be made public?
Yes.
Well, I mean, there is an issue if you, for example, defaulted on your credit card this month because you forgot to pay the bill. Should that be made public so that everybody, without knowing that you are a regular payer, suddenly sees you are a defaulter?
Banks have categorized willful defaulters.
No. So,
yes.
Again, you're saying, now you've come down to there are certain categories of defaulters.
Yes.
It's okay, but certain categories, it is
perhaps
possibly
not okay.
Or not okay.
Yes.
So that's the kind of thinking that we will have to go through.
In your book, you've talked about, like you said, bringing equality through opportunities to education. You just mentioned healthcare as well. The Oxfam, there was an Oxfam report just before Davos, which talked about the fact that the gap between the rich and the poor in India has gotten much worse. What I found interesting is at the end of the report, it basically said that if you were to ensure education, opportunity, and healthcare, then a lot of the savings that's currently going into these three things will then be used. You know, you'll take that off the mind of the poor, and they'll be able to focus then on moving forward. Right. The other option is, and it's being talked about a lot, is minimum income support. Right. Which of the two routes do you think? I mean, the first route is much longer, but which of the two routes do you think would work in India?
As we've, as I talk, as I say in the book, you need two parts of support to a market economy. You need capability building so that people don't enter the market economy when they're born.
Yes.
They enter once they're prepared for it, which means education, adequate healthcare, etc., so that they can participate in an active way. If your child hasn't had the education, has had malnutrition, what position are they in to essentially participate in the economy? And that's why industrial countries over time have built that basic sort of capability building structure. At the same time, if you fall off, if you have some disabilities, if you have bad luck, if there's a calamity that hits and businesses go out, shut down in a big way, what kind of safety net do you have? Again, industrial countries have built that safety net over time. We are a developing country, but we have to think about both these aspects. On the one hand, capability building. On the other hand, something to support those who fall off. And I think both are continuous dialogue.
You've said some fairly strong things about nationalism. Specifically, you have mentioned the RSS as well. If I may, you said the truly committed majoritarian Hindu leader drawn from a young age into the RSS is usually personally austere, which endears him to those who dislike corruption, and he's committed to the cause which makes him ruthless in his methods. They're a serious threat to liberal, tolerant, innovative India. Is anyone specific you're objecting to?
Look,
but you believe nationalism is bad for us.
Let me be very clear here. I'm not saying that every RSS person is in this mold. It's the objectives of an organization that I think are opposed generally to the syncretic nature of India, which I worry about. And of course, there are people who belong to the RSS who are national treasures, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, for example. The broader concern I have is that in an India which essentially has to promote unity amongst its various minorities, amongst its various ethnicities, amongst its various religions, that a focus on majoritarianism, which in many ways is the creed of a variety of nationalist organizations, I think will be problematic going forward. It will create more dissension, more conflict in unnecessary ways, when in fact we need to focus, if we think about nation building, on creating economic growth. And economic growth requires much more of a social consensus. And to my mind, social consensus imposed by the majority is not really the way to go.
You've also said that there is a protectionist streak in some Hindu nationalists fueled by their business backers, and in brackets you've said they have ties to businesses despite their seeming austerity. So you do believe that this sort of nationalism comes with its share, if not more than its share, of corruption?
Not corruption. I mean, I'm not saying that people are personally on the take here. I do mean they have backers. The organization has backers. That there is a protectionist sort of wing of the Indian entrepreneurial sort of establishment. And they have their favorites in every political sort of entity. And there are within this nationalist structure also, protectionists. And so they get backing.
You just described crony capitalism.
Well, I mean, these aren't always people in power. When they are in power, yes, you could argue there is some cronyism there. But when they're out of power, it's a faction which is pushing towards protectionism, towards sort of Indian rules. And often Indian rules favor specific entities and are not just protectionism but biased in terms of favoring particular entities.
Do you believe that the current regime, because it is nationalist, it is backed by the RSS, it does have specific backers and supporters. Do you believe that there is this sort of push for protectionism or cronyism happening in this current government?
I think first, I do think that we have made some significant positive improvements in terms of, auctioning contracts and this and that. But I do think that we also have taken some retrograde steps, tariffs, for example, that we have enhanced. And now, we need a much more transparent process of why and how tariffs are elevated, because otherwise we go back to the old sort of protectionist regime where, there was a lot of murkiness on how the tariffs were raised and in which commodities and in which goods. This is an issue also in the United States today, that those who have access to the administration have a much easier time raising tariffs on their competitors and thus imposing costs on everybody else.
You've talked about nostalgic nationalism, and there is, of course, a large people in business right now who seem austere but are in business. They're talking about how companies that come from around the world are actually like the East India Company. They've come to take over, and it's actually just Indian companies that should do well, and you should only buy from Indian companies. I'm referring specifically to Baba Ramdev and the company that he fronts, Patanjali. Do you believe that that sort of thinking and speaking is bad for us?
I think we got away from that in '91 with the reforms, and I think we should stay that way. Now, I think the more we sort of say we're going to have Indian champions, the more we create the possibility of essentially not doing the best for our consumers, that elevating costs. By all means, we need very productive Indian companies also. I'm not saying we should be biased against them. We should not enter into trade deals which are biased against our companies. We should try and open more markets to them. But if we elevate costs by protecting one segment of our industry, then we render uncompetitive other segments of industry. So that route we followed in the past, and it was not growth enhancing.
So one of the segments that is extremely controlled is agriculture. The government controls who can buy and sell the land, it controls who can sell the produce, who you can sell it to, at what price. The government is actually buying and selling and distributing. Do you believe that that is perhaps detrimental to the good of the farmers?
We need significant agricultural reforms. And we need to make it such that agriculture is a really productive business and that it becomes a growth engine for the economy. I mean, we are the largest milk producer in the world. There are a variety of commodities, rice, for example, in which we are the largest producer. There is a question about whether we should be in the business of producing so much rice given the water that it consumes.
Yes.
But the broader point is, how can we make agriculture an engine of growth. And how can, instead of being what everybody wants to subsidize in this way, that way, and you make this ban, that ban, and something else. So we need to think very carefully about that. There are a number of people, Ashok Gulati, for example, who've written a lot on the kinds of changes that we need in agriculture to make it much more sustainable. And we need to really think about that, because agricultural distress is a big issue.
We've actually reached an acute distress point for agriculture, because a lot again of our reporters who travel and come back with stories tell us that smaller farmers with smaller pieces of land just find it unviable right now. It's no longer a business that makes sense. We're talking again about farm loan waivers, and I know that for you this has always been, you haven't really backed it as an idea that has worked for the farmer, let alone for anyone else. Are you personally disappointed to see us make an entire circle and go back there again? Because we've had opportunities to fix things.
We need to go forward in agriculture, not as you said, in this entire circle. Part of the problem is, as you said, these small farms can be very unproductive, especially if there's no link to value-added work on those farms. It is possible to make relatively small farms very productive, but you can't grow the same things that you grow elsewhere. You have to do something else. That said, I think part of the problem is the exit from agriculture. What do people go into? And are they prepared for those kinds of jobs? We're creating, perhaps service jobs in restaurants, hotels, and so on. Can somebody leave the farm to go into those jobs? What kinds of preparation do they need? Can we create jobs that is more natural for people to go into? Construction, for example. We could certainly try and expand construction significantly. Many countries have grown on that basis. So we need to think very carefully about the whole job creation process.
Would that